About a year ago, I stumbled across a post on the Too Afraid to Ask subreddit. Are human body parts really harvested and sold on the black market? How would that even work? I scrolled through the comments expecting some speculation, maybe even some conspiracy theories, but what I saw was different. People weren't just guessing, they were confirming. Stories of hospitals performing unauthorized surgeries, organ brokers making deals in the shadows, and people getting scammed out of money that they were promised. I got intrigued, so I started searching all over the internet, and that's when I found this place. Chennai, a small town in southern India known locally as Kidneyvakkam, Kidneyville, where nearly every adult resident has sold their kidney. But what's even crazier is that it's not just Chennai that has this nickname. Manila, Philippines, Hokse, Nepal, Herat, Afghanistan, Lahore, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Costa Rica. Scattered across the globe, hidden in plain sight, there are entire communities who depend on selling their kidneys and other organs to survive. Isn't this illegal? And if it is, how does it seem to be thriving in plain sight? To figure it out, I spoke to journalists, international lawyers, and the man who broke the news on the Chennai incident. What I found was worse than I could have ever imagined. The miracle of organ transplants has allowed humankind to show the very best of itself, but unfortunately, it has also allowed it to show its very worst. Every year, over 100,000 people around the world receive the gift of life from selfless donors.
That is the one thing that always gets people like their heads spinning a little bit. When I say to them, yeah, I now have 3 kidneys and 2 pancreases.
But in the shadows, for countless others, something far darker is happening. The buying and selling of human flesh, often taken and in some cases outright stolen, from society's most desperate and vulnerable.
The rule of the red market is that if you have a world-class hospital next to extremely destitute people, you get organ trafficking.
There's no victims that can testify to what happened to them because they're all dead.
When you think of black market organ trafficking, perhaps what comes to mind are urban legends or TV shows. But organ trafficking isn't just a plot in dystopian fiction. It's a real-life, billion-dollar industry that's supposed to be a black market, but is so easily accessible, I don't even know if we can call it that. I just texted someone on Facebook who is ready to sell a kidney.
I am the breadwinner and I need to take action. I have no choice, sir, about that, sir.
If you needed a part of a stranger's body to keep yours working, and money was no object, how far would you be willing to go? To fully understand it, I had to talk to someone who has experienced what it's like to need a transplant. Imagine how it might feel. One day, life is normal, then suddenly, everything changes.
I found out when I was 17.
The voice you hear belongs to Jay, one of our team members here at Aperture.
I was walking home from school one day with one of my buddies, stopped in at the corner store because I had been complaining all day how thirsty I was. Just could not quench the thirst. So being a teenager, I stopped into the old corner store and grabbed a 2-liter bottle of Coke and drank it in about a block, just because I was immensely dehydrated. I had been literally peeing nonstop for about 3 days. So later on that night, I mentioned to my mother, like, I've been really, really thirsty. I don't understand what is going on here. And I told her, and her face just went white. And the next day, we were in the family doctor office, and he was like, yes, you have type 1 diabetes. Your pancreas has just stopped working.
With help from his doctors, Jay was initially able to manage his condition with the help of insulin. But as time went on, a more intense intervention was required in the form of dialysis. And eventually, even more drastic measures became necessary.
Dialysis is, it can only keep you alive for so long. It's one of those things that it's a treatment, but depending on the patient, It can be something that it works great for some. Others, it can just sort of keep you going for as long as you can, but the rest of your system starts to kind of deteriorate because it's linked into that kidney function. So your heart can't keep up, your liver starts to give, everything starts to sort of implode from the inside out without dialysis in the mix there. And even with the dialysis, it gets a little bit tough for people. So I was fortunate. I was extremely fortunate that I was able to get control of it and then qualified for a transplant.
Almost 20 years after learning he was diabetic, Jay was informed that he required a double transplant of both kidney and pancreas. He was added to a wait list until he could be matched with a donor. As a Canadian, on average, that wait can generally take anywhere from a few months to a couple of years. Jay patiently took his place at the back of one of many lines worldwide that include hundreds of thousands of people in need, a number that is growing rapidly. Diabetes, one of the leading causes of kidney failure, is on the rise. Often called a disease of affluence, more and more people are getting diabetes because of the increased amount of unhealthy, processed foods around the world. This unfortunately means that more people will need transplants and more donors will be needed. So suppose you are one of those people who, like our colleague Jay, find yourself in need. First, you will have to join a waiting list. The system for those vary from country to country, but in Canada, each province has its own list with varying wait times. In the US, everyone can join a list in as many states as they want, but there is a catch. Once your turn comes, you need to be able to drop everything and head to a local hospital at a moment's notice. For most, that limits their options to one list in their home state. However, those with greater resources can join multiple lists. Knowing if the call comes, they can fly last minute to any hospital across America. This is how Apple founder Steve Jobs was able to controversially cut his wait for a potential life-saving liver transplant to months instead of years, by not only joining a wait list in his home state of California, but also on the other end of the United States, in Tennessee. Now, for us regular folk, that probably won't be an option. But if you find yourself in need, you can also look for donors yourself. I'm sure you've come across people running campaigns, whether locally or online, for that reason. If you take your message to Facebook, you would notice that in a lot of the same groups where people are searching for organ donors, there are also a number of posts from people who are willing to sell those organs. And just like that, in social media apps anyone can easily access, the door to the dark side of organ transplants is swung wide open. If you were in that position, would you take a peek?
My name is Scott Carney. I'm an investigative journalist and a YouTuber now, and I wrote a book about 13 years ago called The Red Market on the Trail of the World's Organ Brokers, Bone Thieves, Blood Farmers, and Child Traffickers, which is about all of those things.
Unfortunately, for those who have the money, the opportunity to get a second chance at life for a relatively small fee is too enticing to ignore.
So I began the research on the red market when I was foreign correspondent for Wired magazine and Mother Jones and National Public Radio based out of India, where when, sort of one morning, I woke up and a village probably about a mile from my house, huge expose came out in the local media saying that everyone, all the women in the village, had sold their kidneys. And I was shocked. I sort of understood that this was a thing that did happen, but it had been in the recesses of my memory. It was something I thought was more of a urban legend than reality. And then I, went down to the village and I started writing about kidney trafficking, and it is a much bigger thing than anyone would have imagined.
The first thing Scott noticed about the so-called red market was that despite what urban legends and shows like Squid Game might suggest, organs aren't usually taken from people who are kidnapped off the street and dragged into secret operating rooms.
It's not kidnapping people and slicing out their organs and they wake up in bathtubs full of ice. No, the reality is in most cases, it is very poor and destitute people who live in refugee camps, people who are just destitutely poor living in slums, who are given, the opportunity to make $500 and they'll sell their organs for that little. And so what we see is that the same sorts of exploitation that happens with, say, making Nike sneakers is the same thing that happens with the organ markets.
At this point, you might be asking, what is my body actually worth?
If I were going to ask you how much you would sell your kidney for, you're going to come up with an astronomical sum in your mind. You're going to be like, well, yeah, sure, I'd sell my kidney for like $1 million. But the thing is, that's not the way capitalism works. They don't want to buy your kidney for $1 million. They want to buy the kidney for the least possible arbitrage price possible. And so they find somebody who's willing to take a bad deal, which is why these people never see their lots actually improved, because they're being basically mugged by capitalism.
A question that might be worth asking: legally, why can't I sell my own kidney? And the answer is that there's really no concrete answer. Maybe it's simply because it seems so ghoulish and taboo to cut people open, take something out, and exchange it for cash. Maybe as a society which largely opposes prostitution and slavery, we don't feel comfortable treating people, even parts of people, as commodities. And then there's a slippery slope argument that goes something like this. If people have the option of selling kidneys, maybe if and when they rack up debt, there will be an unsavory societal pressure to do so. That it's not enough people who fall in hard times can face hunger, eviction, bankruptcy, and more, that as a society we're seemingly perfectly okay with, but perhaps it is too much to expect people who have hit rock bottom to sell a literal pound of flesh. For these reasons, in general, the only ways to obtain organs are either by legal donation or illegal sale. But there are some slight exceptions. To encourage donations, for example, the Australian government will pay citizens 2 months sick leave if they offer up one of their kidneys, and other countries offer income tax incentives. But as of this moment, Iran is the only country on Earth with a legal and regulated market for selling your kidney. In case you're wondering, they generally go for between $1,000 and $2,000. The catch is that only Iranian citizens can buy or sell theirs. In part, this helps to ensure a steady supply for Iranians in need, but it also is intended to prevent one of the major forces driving black market organ sales.
What we often see in the illegal fleshy organ market in the United States is that occasionally people will be like, hey, my waiting list takes 10 years to get to. Like, it takes me 10 years to get this. I don't want to wait. And what they do is they fly to another country and they come back with another organ. And that's really where you see a lot more of the crimes occurring. It happens across borders.
This brings me to the question that I set out to answer in the beginning. Why did everyone in the village of Chennai sell their kidneys?
Now, at the time, when I was living there, this was just a few years after the tsunami killed 180,000 people around the world. And then a lot of people in those coastal settlements ended up in refugee camps. And there was one outside of Chennai that became known as Kidneyvakkam, or the Kidneyville. Its official name was Tsunami Nagar, which means the village for the tsunami refugee folks.
After the tsunami devastated the region, people were so desperate for money that most of the adult women sold their kidneys just to survive. But even then, they weren't given the full amount that they were promised, so in the end, their kidneys were essentially stolen. I was already deeply unsettled hearing this from Scott, but then he dropped a bombshell. This wasn't an isolated incident. Far from it. It was happening all over the world.
The rule of the red market is that if you have a world-class hospital next to extremely destitute people, you get organ trafficking. It happens all over the world. It's not just South India, although South India is a hotbed. It's also North India. It's also Egypt. It's also South Africa. It's in Brazil. It's in China, Indonesia, the Philippines. Like, this is something that is happening globally, and it has those two things. You have extreme wealth and extremely high technical sophistication next to destitution, and that is where you find horrific abuses.
It's gut-wrenching to see something meant to be an act of selfless generosity twisted into exploitation, often through brutal, illegal means. It's a side of the transplant process that many people never see. And there's more. Way more. I found this report from the UN in 2018 detailing how over 700 Eritreans desperate to escape the war in Ethiopia, sold their kidneys just to afford a passage to Europe in search of work and a better life. They were promised up to $5,000, but after receiving a small down payment, most never saw the rest of the money once their kidneys were taken. One of the victims trusted a broker simply because he was a fellow countryman, only to wake up in agony after undergoing surgery in a makeshift facility to find out the broker had stolen the money and used it to secure his own safe passage. When you consider the fact that all of these victims were undocumented, it's safe to assume that the 700 we know of is only a small fraction of the true number of victims. And there are stories like this all around the world. A crime ring in India that lured poor laborers with promises of work only to drug them and remove their organs. Or a particularly ruthless Pakistani doctor who lured in sick patients with promises of free medical treatment only to have their kidneys stolen with the help of an auto mechanic acting as an amateur anesthesiologist. In 2013, a respected doctor at a Costa Rican children's hospital was caught paying desperate locals $10,000 for their kidneys. But this wasn't just a small operation. It was part of an international trafficking ring. Kidneys were harvested in Costa Rica or Israel, where many buyers lived. The scheme unraveled when a donor, still recovering from surgery, died mid-flight on his way home, exposing the entire operation. And in Turkey in 2021, buyers paid $45,000 per kidney. The money was split 3 ways, between the donor, the surgeon, and the middleman who found these buyers and donors on social media.
The worst story that in my book, as far as I'm concerned, was on the border of Nepal and India, where there was a shortage of blood, where Nepalis would come over and they're looking for blood and they're looking for surgeries because Nepal's health system is even worse than India's health system. So they all come over to India, and they just don't have enough blood to do normal surgeries. So what happened is that a former dairy farmer and phlebotomist would kidnap people from the rail station and drain 4 or 5 pints of blood from them so that they were minimally conscious. And then he kept them imprisoned in a cowshed for up to 6 months until basically they died to supply the local blood supply in that town. Now, that's an extreme case, right? That's a hugely extreme case. But this is the sort of logic that occurs once you start treating parts of bodies as actual commodities. You get people who will do really bad things.
When we first started digging into this, I thought it was going to be black and white. There were the good guys and the bad guys. You know, the people who happily wait in line versus those who go to the black market. Respectable doctors working in reputable hospitals versus money-hungry butchers working in dark and dirty, unsanitary basements. But real life is less black and white and a whole lot of gray.
So the strangest thing about the market for human organs, the illegal market for human organs around the world, is that it's largely connected to the legal market. So while we do have legal donation policies and programs in the United States, that shortfalls does occasionally get made up by illegal organ brokers in foreign countries. And the fascinating thing is that it actually gets done pretty much above board. It's mostly about forging documents to make organs look like they're ethically procured.
In 2012, Levi Isaac Rosenbaum was convicted for buying kidneys from desperate Israeli and Palestinian donors and reselling them in New York for up to $160,000. His VIP clients had their transplants arranged in prestigious Manhattan hospitals. When the crime ring was exposed, he said, "If someone needs a kidney and someone else wants money to sell one, where's the crime?" Rosenbaum referred to himself as a mere matchmaker. But you see, as Scott puts it,
it never works out for the person who's selling their organ under duress where they are happy with the transaction. I've interviewed probably at least 100 people who've sold their kidneys in India. And the way it works is you get probably about $500. Usually you're promised like $2,000, but they only give you a little bit up front and then they never pay you the back end. That's sort of like the standard model. So 1, they usually feel ripped off. And 2, it's not enough money to actually radically change their lives.
At this point, I felt like I was done. I had found the answer to the Reddit question that started it all. Are human body parts really harvested and sold on the black market? And how would that even work? Yes, they definitely are. And the way it works is a lot more straightforward than you might think. I had heard enough and was about to round up my interview with Scott when he said this.
So there were several reports by transplant surgeons in China who talked about executing prisoners through organ retrieval processes, removing organs from prisoners while they were still alive and taking out the last organ to actually execute them.
It was far worse than anything I had seen or heard up until this point. Sure, capitalism means that haves and have-nots will always exist, and the result of that is the desperate having to sell whatever they can to get by, including pieces of themselves. But what Scott was implying here was on a whole nother level. So after I thanked him and ended the call, I knew that there was still a lot more I needed to know. After going through countless articles, research papers, and public documents, I discovered that allegations of state-sanctioned and state-organized systematic organ harvesting in China had been going on for nearly 2 decades. To find out more, I tracked down an investigator whose work exposed this program and got him nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize.
My name is David Matus. I'm an international human rights lawyer, and I've been doing human rights work for more or less all my professional career.
Like millions around the world, David was shocked by a public revelation made almost 20 years ago.
There was a woman with a pseudonym Annie in March 2006 who made a public statement in Washington, D.C. that her ex-husband had been harvesting the corneas of practitioners of the spiritually based set of exercises, Falun Gong, between 2001 and 2003 in Sujiatan Hospital in Shenyang City in Liaoning Province in China, and that other doctors in the same hospital had been harvesting other organs from these patients. The victims died through organ extraction and their bodies were cremated, and their organs were being sold to transplant tourists and wealthy and well-connected Chinese.
Alongside fellow Canadian human rights lawyer David Kilger, David Matus set to work on a stunning report, eventually delivered to the UN, entitled Bloody Harvest.
On reflection, it was probably better off for us, well, not so much for us, but the people we might talk to, if we didn't get a visa, because there was a vice president of the European Parliament who was also interested in this issue and was able to get to China and did talk to some people, but the people he talked to were arrested and disappeared after he talked to them. So it's frankly safer to talk to people once they get out of China than to talk to them while they're in China.
The investigation was painstakingly stitched together.
I knew that this involved a lot of research because what we're told from the start is there's no victims that can testify to what happened to them because they're all dead. There's no bodies to autopsies. There's no witnesses except perpetrators who are not going to be that reliable as witnesses, even if they're going to say anything. There's no records except hospital and prison records, which are not going to be available to us. So,
Falun Gong was a quasi-religious movement with a strong component of both spiritual and physical fitness, founded in China in the early 1990s. Quickly gaining momentum and amassing over 100 million followers, it was perceived as a threat to the Chinese communist regime. Followers were rounded up and herded into prisons. According to whistleblowers and Falun Gong followers who managed to escape from China, their experience in jail was much like what you'd expect for political prisoners, only with one big exception.
They'd be subject to periodic blood tests and organ examinations, usually about every 6 months.
Another crucial piece of the puzzle, voluntary organ donations are, as a matter of culture and custom, exceptionally rare in China. In a 6-year period between 2003 and 2009, the number of Chinese organ donors from a nation of, at that point, 1.3 billion people was 130. Not 130,000, 130. A campaign from the Chinese Red Cross in 2011 added a whopping additional 37 people to that list. And yet, at the same time as the Falun Gong roundups began, the number of organ transplants performed in China exploded into the tens of thousands. Overnight, there was a ready supply of healthy organs not only for Chinese residents, but for a small army of outsiders willing to pay for them, no questions asked. Perhaps it's naive to believe that doctors dedicated to saving lives would be immune to corruption, but time and again, experienced professionals have been drawn into a system that twists their mission into something far darker.
Unfortunately, it's not unusual for professionals to get identified with a human rights violating system. I mean, we saw that with the Nazis, where the doctors and the lawyers as well were systematically cooperative with the Nazi regime.
And not unlike the prisoners in Nazi concentration camps, for tens of thousands of Falun Gong victims, the experience was nothing short of state-sanctioned hell on earth.
If the party or the state or the police or the investigators knew that a practitioner was Falun Gong, they'd be arrested. They'd be asked to recant, renounce, denounce, and if they did, they're let go. If they didn't, they'd be tortured. But if even after torture they didn't do that, they'd remain in arbitrary indefinite detention. And they were just waiting, basically, in indefinite detention until a patient with a matching blood type, ideally similar tissue type, similar organ size, came and wanted an organ. And the hospitals advertised this. They had high prices, but you could book organs on demand in advance, even for vital organs. So once a patient showed up, the Falun Gong practitioner would be taken out of their cell and put in another part of the prison and injected with various drugs, immobilizing drugs, anticoagulant drugs, and then taken to a white van that was brought from the hospital. In the white van, the organs would be extracted, and the Falun Gong practitioner killed through the organ extraction, and the remains of the body would be left at the prison for cremation, and the organs would be taken to the hospital.
Mattis and Kilger noted over 40,000 organ transplants performed in China between 2000 and 2005 without any known source of voluntary donors. They offered this as a baseline for illegally harvested organs, with the total number likely being even higher. For their efforts in 2010, Mattis and his colleagues were nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. The Parliaments of Canada, the European Union, and the United States House of Representatives each adopted resolutions condemning the Chinese practice of organ harvesting. As for China, they dismissed the allegations, and although blatant marketing efforts for transplant tourism died down somewhat, business as usual continued. In fact, it's likely bigger than ever, with some describing what the Chinese Communist Party is doing as a genocide.
I'm Geoffrey Nice, and I'm an English lawyer, and I chaired two tribunals about the People's Republic of China. One, the China Tribunal, dealing with forced organ harvesting of prisoners of conscience, but mostly of Falun Gong practitioners, and then secondly, the Uyghur Tribunal into the persecution of the Uyghurs.
Although there's no way to prove it, forced organ harvesting from Falun Gong has probably slowed down somewhat since David Mattis' investigation. Good news? Well, not really. If that is indeed the case, it's not really because the government became nicer. It's because Falun Gong believers have become better at hiding, so they're more difficult to identify and arrest. And because the Chinese government has likely exhausted the supply of young, healthy Falun Gong followers to harvest organs from in the first place. What's worse, China has cultivated a new pipeline of political prisoners who double as unwilling donors, a largely Muslim ethnic group from northwest China. Like me, you probably had never heard of the Uyghur population until stories started circulating a few years back of massive roundups by the Chinese government under the pretense of fighting terrorism. Shortly after these mass arrests became known to the world outside of China, so too did new allegations of organ harvesting that were strikingly similar to claims that had been previously made by members of Falun Gong.
This was evidence of people saying falsely, ringing up from somewhere else saying, my auntie, my sister, my brother needs a liver or a kidney or something else, and getting the response from the hospital or doctor in China, yeah, when would you like it, next week or the week after? Whereas everywhere else in the world, many countries having significant voluntary donor schemes, you might have to wait years for a liver or a heart. And yet here there was a hospital in China saying, next week, almost saying, would you like the afternoon or the morning shift?
On December 9th, 2021, Sir Geoffrey delivered a chilling message. In the judgment of the Uyghur Tribunal, the Chinese government's policies towards the Uyghur population, including forced organ harvesting, constituted the most serious crime against humanity, genocide. Having delivered this judgment, Sir Geoffrey and the rest of the tribunal could only hope it would lead to action.
But when it comes to the Uyghur tribunal judgment, although of course many countries were behind us because they were now hostile to China, on the question of genocide they declined our several invitations to accept the finding or to say why they didn't. And that's very important because findings of genocide by governments means that governments then have to do something.
Despite the fact that very few people outside of China disputed the Uyghur Tribunal's findings, the governments around the world, probably including your government, failed to take any real action. Why and how? By relying on a cowardly legal technicality. Western governments pointed out that China had not actually been tried in the International Court of Justice, conveniently ignoring the fact that everyone knew such a trial stood no chance of ever actually happening.
Supposing you were walking down the road, and there was an open door, and beyond the open door was a man with a big rolling pin, beating his wife over the head in a way that would certainly lead to her death. Do you stand at the door and say, well, that's very interesting, I think I better get a judge along in to see if I ought to do something about that? Or do you do something entirely different? And since we know that genocides don't stop of their own accord, they need to be stopped by outside, then the Uyghur judgment's been disappointing, not because it hasn't been accepted around the world by parliaments and even some governments as completely accurate, but because it hasn't led to governments saying, this is genocide, we will act.
In May of 2024, China issued something called the Regulation on Donation and Transplantation of Human Organs. It basically established that transplanted organs could only come from volunteer donors. Sounds great. However, many experts believe that this is just basically lip service to try to convince the world it's innocent. It's disappointing. Even if our elected officials are not prepared to take action against the inhumane treatment of Uyghurs and other political prisoners within China's borders, there are some practical steps that could combat the black market much closer to home. For example, patients who receive organ transplants typically require extensive follow-up care. Doctors could be legally required to report any patients who return from overseas trips with mysterious new scars or newly acquired organs. Those tend to be pretty hard to hide. But at this very moment, throughout the world, few, if any, such common sense laws exist. At some point after hearing all of this, I started to wonder if the miracle of transplant was really a miracle at all. Maybe us finding out that we can switch our parts wasn't such a good thing. But then I hopped on the phone with my friend Jay and well, I completely changed my mind. After waiting on the list for years, Jay finally got the call that saved his life.
When I found out that the transplant was going to happen, I was volunteering somewhere and we were about to do a big fundraiser, and I was standing in front of this group of people that I was supposed to be talking to go over what they're supposed to be doing. And I get a call on my phone and I look down and I see the number and I'm just kind of like staring at it, and I've got these faces gawking at me, and I'm just like, you're going to have to excuse me for a minute. I step off to a separate room, and that was the call. They're like, how soon can you get down here? We might have something for you. And that's where it started. When you get that call, you have a bag packed at home. You're made aware about a month before that you're shortlisted. So have your things ready. And then when that call comes, it's your job to get down there as quick as you can.
Jay's procedure was an immediate success.
But waking up in the hospital room on the transplant floor, the first thing I did was I looked to my right and I could see the rig they have set up. They've got, your IV bags going on. They've lots of things that beep and bloop, and, you've got things attached to your arms, watching the blood pressure, all that kind of fun stuff. And I saw a little bag of urine which is a sign that the kidney function was working. I've never been so happier to see a bag of pee.
When mealtime comes around for most of us, all we need to do is decide what we're in the mood to munch on. But for someone like Jay, who'd been managing his blood sugar with intense help from modern medicine for 2 decades, things were never that simple.
Roast beef, mixed vegetables, and potatoes with a glass of apple juice. That's the first meal that I had after it was 3 days post-procedure. And it's one of those moments. Even hearing the doctor order the meal for me out in the hallway, that almost had me in tears. The nurse said, okay, I'll order a meal. I'll get him set up with the diabetic meal. And the doctor was like, no, go. He's on the regular diet. He's not diabetic anymore. And hearing that really just floored me.
But unfortunately, organ transplants don't offer a permanent fix.
With, I believe, the majority of organ transplants, nothing is permanent. I know that I should be extremely fortunate if I can make it to 10 years with the kidney and the pancreas. I'm now heading into year 10. Anything above and beyond that for kidney and pancreas, they sort of consider it's like, okay, yeah, that's great. That's bonus time. So I live on edge a little bit now, knowing that I'm coming up to that 10-year mark where I'm probably going to start to see decreased kidney function, decreased pancreas function. My levels are going to start to slip a little bit, but I've also had 10 years to prepare for that.
But for the last 10 years, starting from the moment he arrived in the hospital to receive a new lease on life, Jay has also carried an awareness of an enormous sacrifice that was made for him.
It was like a sense of happiness and nervousness, of course, but then it's also weighted by, because I have a deceased donor, that somewhere out there's somebody going through the exact opposite. There's a family, there are friends of the donor who, as excited as you are, they're going through one of those toughest moments of their lives. So the idea that you are sort of carrying almost like a memorial to your donor, you have literal pieces of them in you, it can be overwhelming at times. It can be something where you are living your life for yourself, but you also realize that you have this individual who is forever in your life, who is forever literally in your body, that you can never thank in person. There's no way to show them the appreciation you have for a sacrifice they've made so that you can have a better life. And to have that idea of, every time I have a meal, that person's gift is making it the fact that I can have that whatever I choose to eat. When I decide to cheat and maybe have a little bit of Ben and Jerry's, I'm able to do that because I have this other individual's pancreas.
By the way, something most of us would never guess, when you receive a new organ, they don't necessarily remove the old ones.
That is the one thing that always gets people like their heads spinning a little bit. When I say to them, yeah, I now have 3 kidneys and 2 pancreases.
For Jay, the system has worked. But for others, as we've seen, the waiting game is simply too much to bear. Imagine you woke up tomorrow and learned that you needed a transplant. Put yourself in the shoes of someone who is sick and scared and potentially in a race against the clock. Imagine sitting there on a waiting list, day after day, powerless, checking and rechecking your phone, hoping a life-saving call will come. After a while, you might be tempted to at least see what other options might be out there. You might discover that, even if your financial circumstances would never allow you to just hop on a plane to Sri Lanka or Nepal, opportunities to buy human organs are hiding in plain sight, wherever you live, advertised on some of the world's most popular apps and websites.
I don't particularly want to answer that question. And the reason I don't want to answer that question is because I don't want to give people tips on how to access this world. And very generally speaking, Is there a route to get organs from the third world if you are in short supply? And what I can say is yes.
Scott Carney was understandably reluctant to answer when we asked him where people in need connect with organ brokers on the internet. We also don't want to share tips, but when scrolling through the sad and endless social media posts of people in need hoping to find a donor match, we couldn't help but notice very different kinds of posts in the same organ donor communities. People claiming to live in countries like Africa and Asia whose profiles mention only their blood types and passport status. It's like they're not even real people, just body parts. Like buying a 4 parts iPhone off eBay. Our journalist Mike reached out to a few of them, and to our surprise, in less than an hour, he was speaking to a man in the Philippines who claimed he was in such desperate need for cash that he was willing and ready to strike a deal.
You have a kidney?
Yes, sir.
Is it you, or do you sell them?
Mine, sir.
It's yours.
Yes.
I need a kidney, but are you sure that you're comfortable with this?
I have no choice, sir, about that, sir. I am the breadwinner and I need to take action.
After that conversation, the man sent a series of increasingly desperate follow-up messages, and it wasn't just him. More messages poured in from other people trying to sell us their organs. Was the man we were speaking to ready to sell us his kidney, or was he just a scammer looking to make a quick buck? We'll honestly never know. Real or not, the man we spoke to represents hundreds of thousands worldwide who face a grim reality. Their body parts are the only thing they own with real value. And by posing as a buyer, we had taken the first steps down the same path as many before us, those with the means to exploit desperation all the way to its bloody conclusion. The good news is that if this troubles you as much as it troubles us, you can personally take action to combat black market organ sales. The best way to do so comes at zero cost to you at all, and that's to become an organ donor. There are many myths when it comes to donating. For example, the one that cold and calculating emergency room doctors will purposely let you die if they know you're an organ donor.
I have heard those rumors. I've actually had people bring that up to me, where they've said, doctors will let someone die because they know they're an organ donor and they just happen to have somebody one ward over who needs that heart. So they're just going to let them go. I've never believed any of it. I would have to flat out say to them that they're wrong.
No, Steve Jobs level shenanigans aside, rich people can't buy their way to the front of the legal line. And no, despite what some might claim, donors who agree to share their useful organs in the event of their untimely passing are not disfigured in a way that makes open casket funerals impossible. On the other hand, here are some facts. Body parts from deceased donors can save up to 8 lives and improve the lives of up to 75 people. Remember, internal organs aren't the only things that can be transplanted, also corneas, hands, and even faces. In death, we can give others the gift of sight, the gift of renewed and rejuvenated abilities, the gift of life itself. If you aren't a registered organ donor, the process is simple and we strongly encourage you to look into it. What better way to die than to give life? So what is the future of the organ trade, both legal and illegal? I'm sure you've heard of Brian Johnson, the guy who takes shots of his own blood to reverse his biological age. Is Johnson an eccentric outlier? Or is he a glimpse of what's to come from increasing numbers of the wealthy 1%? As the pursuit of eternal youth through biohacking inches closer to reality, the demand for healthy organs, stem cells, and even unbelievably, the blood of the youth is only expected to rise. Could we one day live in a world with real-life vampires? Only time will tell. But on the other hand, perhaps in the future, scientific advances could someday make the need for human donor kidneys obsolete. Just last month, a genetically modified kidney from a pig was given to a human recipient. It's a potential game changer. But this surgery, performed at the Massachusetts General Hospital, was highly experimental, and even in the best case scenario, medical science remains many years away from replacing the need for human donors. For the foreseeable future, the demand for healthy organs is large and growing, and while many people are willing to play by the rules and wait their turn in line, many others will game the system however they can.
This is true of human rights violations generally. If you don't stop them, they spread.
Our coworker Jay is the only person we know who has actually had to reckon with the issues covered in this video on a personal level. As an organ recipient himself, he has interacted with many others who have faced the same situation and the same types of decisions.
I ran into a woman about 2 years after my transplant, and she was a choreographer in a theater in China. And the owner of the theater was in the midst of kidney failure. And so she had gone over, she had done her contract, and she was invited back the next year. She comes back the next year, she asks, how is he doing? And they were like, oh yeah, he got his kidney within about a week. And she's used to the Canadian system and had said, how did that happen? And they're like, oh no, well, he bought it off of someone, but he won't tell us who. So she says to me, sort of somewhat sheepishly, she's like, does that happen here? I'm like, no, it's not supposed to. She's like, because I started asking around over there, and that's kind of like how it's done. They don't sort of do it. It's like nothing's official. Everything is just, they just buy it. So all the rich people wait a couple of days, get their kidney, and go. They'll pay a hospital to do the procedure for them. Everything is money. I'm gonna get up on my high horse here. I don't think I could, in good conscience, say, yeah, that was the right move for them to make. Yeah, they should have. I can understand why they want to fork over $15,000 and head over to China and find myself a kidney, and not just find myself a kidney, probably have a bit of a buffet to choose from. Yeah, I don't think I would ever scrap that. Not, I don't think, I know I would never be able to support that. If somebody were to say to me, I woke up after my kidney transplant and they said, listen, we ended up having to buy your kidney from a third-party broker who took this from an individual while they slept, I would just find a way to take it out. No, I don't want to have that reminder of what they had to go through in order for me to be alive.
For a person of means who just wants a kidney as soon as possible, no questions asked, anything is possible for a price. And once they are on a sterilized operating table awaiting a life-saving procedure, perhaps it is easy for them to forget that the new organ that is about to become a part of their body might have come from a village somewhere in India where everyone had their kidneys stolen from them with the promise of life-changing money that never came.